There are two explanations. Either we are incredibly lucky, or someone somewhere is looking after us. This is an astonishing planet, and I just think I look at the complexity and the wonderment of it, and I go, I don't see that as being randomness, chance, or anything like that.
You're listening to the Log by the Fire podcast. It's the podcast where we kick back, we talk about the meaning of life, maybe tell a ghost story or two, and give thanks to the one who made it all possible. I'm your host, Travis Kircher, the man with a face for radio and a voice for magazines. So grab a log, maybe get some s'mores ready. Just make sure you're downwind of the smoke. Someone's coming out of the woods, and I think they have a story to tell. Thanks for joining me for this episode of the A Log by the Fire podcast. Now, today's guest is someone I'd wanted to talk to for a long time. His name is Chris Walley, and he's the author of a series of science fiction novels written from a Christian worldview. Now, that series is called the Lamb Among the Stars trilogy, and that trilogy consists of 3 books, The Shadow and Night, The Dark Foundations, and The Infinite Day. Now, I honestly had never heard of these books before. I actually found them through the Christian science fiction entry on Wikipedia and decided to check them out on Amazon. They were hardbacks. They had a pretty cool glossy cover with pretty mind-blowing cosmic artwork, and I liked the description, so I ordered the first one. I wasn't quite ready for what arrived. These books are monsters. They're like Lord of the Rings. There were a bunch of maps on the first few pages, and there was a basic timeline showing when the series takes place. It's actually set in 13,851 AD. Now, by the time I'd gotten through the first few pages, I knew I was reading something really unique. The books tell the story of the colonists on the planet Farhome, which is the furthest planet of explored space. It's a far home. At this point in time, mankind is out amongst the stars. We've explored and colonized countless new worlds, and Farhome is a planet that has been terraformed. It started out as a dry, dead world, but over thousands of years, it was made green and lush and suitable for human beings to live on. And this is all done by the colonists for the glory of God. Now, the colonists living on Farhome, like all of the rest of mankind at this point, have made their peace with God. Millennia before, there was what Christians would call a worldwide revival. Mankind, en masse, turned back to God and accepted Christ's sacrifice on the cross. They've turned their backs on what Christians would call their sinful nature. Because of that, greed, violence, racism, deception, and other forms of evil are virtually non-existent at this point. That's why mankind has been free to devote his energy to exploration and discovery, not just in space, but in all the sciences. Man isn't perfect at this point. There is still death, and the second coming of Christ has not taken place yet. But sin and evil have a much weaker hold than they had, say, in the 20th century. So on Farhome, we meet our main character, Mero D'Avanos. He's a forester, which is really a job that's part conservationist, part scientist, part forest ranger. During a visit to his uncle's farm one night, Merrill and his little nephew are surprised to see a meteor streak across the sky. The only problem is, it turns out it's not really a meteor. And it's not too long before Merrill realizes that something is lurking in the woods near the home. Something that's not human. Something that frightens his little niece so badly that when she sees it during a walk through the woods, she almost goes mad. And it's something that brings our other protagonist, Vero, through several jump gates all the way from ancient Earth to investigate. Now, you know how Lord of the Rings begins as kind of this intimate little story in Hobbiton, and it ends with an apocalyptic war? That's how this series progresses. At first, it's all about Farhome. It's all about those colonists, a frontier planet on the edge of explored space. But the series ends in a climactic battle that spans the known universe. In the course of this book, there's space travel. There are monsters, robots, angels, demons, intercessory prayer, and satellite surveillance. Along the way, we look at the ethics of man's relationship with technology, but the most frightening enemy is something Merrill has never had to face before. It's sin. Sin has come back. We see it in the first few chapters when someone tells Merrill a little white lie. and he doesn't know how to deal with it. He's never experienced deception before of any kind. But like a cancer, sin begins to poison the whole planet. And before long, Farhome is desperately trying to warn the homeworld, ancient Earth, that sin has returned. The only problem is, it's going to take 50 years for the message to get there. And by then, it'll be too late. What makes this trilogy different from books by maybe some other Christian authors is the writer himself. Chris Walley isn't just, a good storyteller. He's a believer in Christ. He's also a scientist. He was born in Wales. He got his doctorate in geology and spent much of his life teaching science to students in Beirut, where he met his wife, Allison. Some of that teaching actually took place during the Lebanese Civil War. He went on to become the adjunct professor of geology at Wheaton College, and eventually he and Allison moved to Lourdes, France, where they're involved in worship at Holy Trinity Church, Cannes. They have 4 grandchildren. I was excited to speak with Chris because I love his books, and he has a British accent, which, as we all know, means credibility. And if there's one thing this podcast needs, it's credibility. A couple of housekeeping measures before we get started. This interview actually took place on August 30th of 2020, and that was during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. My questions, some of them, have been re-recorded and in some cases rephrased for clarity. And partly that was because this is my first podcast, and I really didn't know what I was doing when I was recording. And to be honest, I'm sitting here looking at a mixer. There are red and yellow flashing lights, and I still don't know what those mean. So you're going to have to maybe give me some grace for some of the editing errors that might take place over the course of this podcast. And now, without further ado, my guest, Chris Walley. Well, thank you for joining me, Mr. Walley. It really is an honor to have you on the podcast, really all the way from Lourdes, France. And I guess to open this interview, I have to ask you about your background. One of the things that, to me, is super cool about your books is the amount of scientific knowledge that you pack inside of them. For example, in speaking about the idea of terraforming, and for our listeners who maybe not be familiar with the concept of terraforming, that's basically the process and the work needed to make a planet that is cold, that is dead, something like Mars, to make that planet livable for human beings. So, terraforming would involve creating an atmosphere, adding oxygen, creating carbon dioxide, making it green, making it, viable for vegetation. That's a big part of your book. And you include a lot of knowledge about geology, about meteorology, space science, and so forth. That's not common. That level of hard science is not common in quote-unquote science fiction nowadays. A lot of the science in today's science fiction kind of takes a backseat to fantasy. But you have that scientific background. You got your doctorate in geology and spent years teaching at the American University of Beirut. I'm just curious, what drew you to the sciences in the first place?
Yeah, well, that's good. I kind of grew up in northern England, and there's a great tradition of sort of science and things, and I kind of like the natural sciences. I never really liked blood or tissue or things like that. So I kind of like geology because rocks are cool and they're dead, and you can put them in a drawer on a Friday night and get them out on a Monday morning, and they haven't rotted. So I sort of drifted into. I chose that, and then I got a chance to do a PhD, which took me into North Africa, actually, which is kind of interesting. And then I got offered a job in Lebanon, which is another story. But anyway, that's it. So I've been involved in science. I should probably say that actually, I think in the UK, the gulf between science and Christianity is probably not quite as big as it is in the States. There's sort of we haven't quite had that. We never really had fundamentalism in the UK in the sense that you had in the States, and I don't think the battle lines were ever fully drawn. But I became a Christian when I did my PhD. But there we are. So that was doing my doctorate.
I have to hear that story. How did you become a Christian? What led you to decide that it was time to give your life to Christ?
Well, I grew up like a lot of people of my generation. I was still basically church-going community, so I had a sort of fairly solid Christian background. And in my first degree, I basically pretty much turned against it, although I met a number of Christians. And then second, started to do my PhD. And the first year I repeated what I was doing in my first degree, the usual sort of stuff. Let's not go into details. And it just paled. I just thought, well, is this what it's all about? I began looking for things that were, and I had some. I was in contact. I was a lab assistant in a lab where there were a couple of Christians and things like this. And I basically just got involved, started to go to the CU. And then I picked up, miraculously, I went to a library to find out some more about Christianity. And I picked up a book of quotations by C.S. Lewis, and who will, I'm sure, appear later in this conversation. And that just basically things crumbled. So I just one evening, I just said, okay, God, I've messed up here. Over to you, like that. Yeah, okay. And then bits and pieces slotted into place afterwards and things like that. So yeah, that was basically it. That was 40 odd years ago. Yeah, no, it was. Yes, it was. Yeah, it was a good few years ago, Travis. Good few years ago.
Do you remember what quotations they were from C.S. Lewis, or was it mere Christianity?
No, it was a book. It was a book of all his thought. And the interesting thing is, I've looked for it ever since. I've never been able to find it, and it's almost as though God said, "No, that was useful at that point." But it basically, there was a whole array of books in the library, and I now realize most of them are garbage. And this one I'd vaguely heard of Lewis. I'd never read the Narnia books, and I knew he was, and it was just like hammer blows. I just thought, gosh, this guy expresses so truth so well, so clearly, that any intellectual opposition I had just crumbled away like that. And so there's the intellectual sort of pull, if you like, coupled with the sort of the hole in the soul, which and it. I was very fortunate. I went into the Christian Union. The Christian Union is full of good, solid people reading good, solid books, and that was. And a lot of them were scientists, interestingly enough. And that was that sort of put me on the right foot at the start, I think. Yeah, no, it was good.
Hearing you talk about science kind of takes me back to my brief stint in engineering school, my very short-lived stint in engineering school. And one of the things that I remember was, and I'm probably making a generalization here, but it seems to me that there are scientists and there are fiction writers, but there are very few scientists who are fiction writers. And the reason I say that is just stereotyping. Scientists seem to be analysts, and they seem to use one side of their brains, whereas a writer tends to be more of an artist, and they use the other side of their brains. But in this sense, I look at writers like yourself and Arthur C. Clarke. You're both. It's like you guys are kind of unique because you're using both sides of your brain. So what led you to want to become a fiction writer as a scientist?
Well, I think there's an interesting point. I think I didn't go to a totally good secondary school, and I think probably age 14, 15, I was on the cusp, and I could have gone either way. I could have gone to the arts, and I could have gone to the sciences. I loved reading. I had a very isolated childhood, and I immersed myself in books, and I kind of got the ear for things. And I mean, it's interesting you should mention. I mentioned Arthur C. Clarke, who I think would also say would be a bit of an influence. So I like that. Why I started writing is very interesting. I basically went to Beirut in 80, stayed there till 84, came back, started to do oil company consultancy with a small outfit, and the oil price slumped. And literally, there were just days where we just sat in the office staring at the phone. And I just thought, no, let me just try it. Let's try and fill this void, And I used to do a lot of flying, and I'd often pick up books at the airport. And so I don't. So actually, most of this stuff I can probably do just as well. So just one of those ridiculous things that one does in life. I started writing, and the first book actually did very well. It actually did well in Heart of Stone. I did it under the name John Howarth. Actually did well in the States, and it even got a modest review in Christianity Today. This whole time I've graced its pages. And so there was a real encouragement there that I'd actually, demonstrated that I could do it. And anyway, the oil price after that improved, business picked up, and I ended up flying around the world a bit more. But I proved to myself, in a sense, that I could tell it. I think there's two things, Travis, isn't there? There's literature and there's telling a tale. And I think I can tell a tale, and I think telling a tale is what is the name of the game. So kind of, that was where I was at.
Now, we've already mentioned Arthur C. Clarke. Who are some other authors or writers who have influenced your writing through the years?
Well, I'm going to be boring here because the fantasy side really was Tolkien. I mean, just the discovery of Lord of the Rings at the beginning of the 70s was just sort of, there are whole passages of that I can probably, quote from, I haven't read it for a number of years, but it was, in fact, actually, I think Tolkien was an influence on me becoming a Christian, because Lord of the Rings, in a sense, makes, it's been much criticized for it, there is good and there is bad. And basically, you are forced in the book to ally yourself with one or the other. And I very much, obviously allied myself to the side of there was the cosmic good. And I think that laid a foundation, which probably Lewis built on, which would be interesting. Arthur C. Clarke, obviously a major, a good, competent writer. I don't think he ever accused Clarke of literature, but he wrote some fine tales, and he also had a very good thing about a last line. So many of Clarke's short stories and things end with a really resounding, last line, which I thought, boy, that's a way to end a chapter. The one that's the 9 billion names of God, which ends with a wonderful thing at the end, and one by one the stars were going out, or something like that. That's just a real spine chilling. It's a great one. Anyway, I burble. So people like that, and also I used to read various thriller things. A couple of British authors are very good. One would be John Buchan, who used to write good, solid. Okay, they're outdated now, but they were good, solid action adventure tales. And that went to the DNA.
Growing up as a kid, I watched a lot of science fiction on TV, saw a lot of movies, read a lot of books, and one of the things that I noticed time and time again in reading, and most of this was what I think you and I would call secular science fiction. Now, let me define that. By secular science fiction, what I'm referring to, the term secular, basically refers to fiction that is purely materialistic in nature. It may be atheistic, but for the most part, it's fiction that says that there is nothing beyond the physical world that we can see and hear and touch with the five senses. And in this type of science fiction, I've noticed this kind of similar repetitive pattern. It's basically this kind of clinical stoic secular humanism, basically that says that mankind is evolving. In some cases, he's going to evolve and basically overcome greed and violence, and essentially evolve into some kind of super intelligent super being. In some cases, this without a physical body and maybe made up of light or energy or something like that. A good example of this, if anybody's familiar with the Stanley Kubrick film 2001: A Space Odyssey, it's based off of a book that was written at the same time by Arthur C. Clarke. And in that film, if you're familiar with it, the Dave Bowman character eventually becomes the Star Child, which is a super intelligent, the next step in human evolution. This theme kind of goes through. You see it in individual Star Trek episodes. You've seen it in shows like Babylon 5. One example that really stands out to me is another book by Arthur C. Clarke. It's called Childhood's End. And spoiler alert, if you haven't read the book, if you plan on reading it, I'm about to tell the ending, so you may want to shut the podcast off now. But at the end of the book, mankind's children, literally the children, under 18, basically evolve so far mentally past their parents that they basically are no longer able to communicate with them. They're on such a higher plane that they can't communicate with their parents. And at the end of the book, these kids kind of close themselves off, start playing with matter and energy, and basically leave the earth and leave their parents there to die. The earth is destroyed because of their fooling with their environment, matter and energy, and so forth. It's kind of a repetitive, that human evolution aspect is basically it's kind of a lot of those the secular science fiction that we read has kind of the same ending. It kind of talks about man evolving and just kind of disappearing in light and energy, and that's their view of the destiny of man. And I'm just wondering, have you experienced this in books by secular humanists like Arthur C. Clarke and other science fiction? And as a Christian, what is your response to that worldview?
Yeah. I think you're right. I think and probably secular science fiction has got itself into a hole. And what I was trying to get out of and it emerges more and more in the trilogy as the trilogy goes through, is to broaden it out into the supernatural and things like that. But actually, I think almost in a sense, this is the problem with strict evolution, strict Darwinism. There's only two fates. We either get better or we die out. Yeah, I can't get terribly excited about either, and yeah, and I think you're right. There are problems with Clarke's worldview. It's very narrow. It's very much of its time. There probably have been some more interesting stuff, but I'll be absolutely honest, don't really read a lot of science fiction at the moment, probably because I just can't get excited, and it's not selling, I don't think, particularly. If you look, I'm old enough to remember when there was a big section marked science fiction, and next to it was a smaller section of fantasy. Now it's fantasy, possibly / science fiction, but the sword and sorcery, the fantasy takes over, and I think that's interesting. I think hard science on its own is hard. It's a hard soil to. I mean, once you've written one, and what people try and do is bring aliens in and things, but then that's a little bit like invoking the supernatural without invoking God. It sort of invokes some sort of strangeness or alienness, but it's not easy to do. Aliens are not easy to do.
In some sense, it's and again, I guess especially Clarke's work, it's magnificent, and then it's kind of cold and depressing.
I think the adjective "cold" is absolutely. You put your finger on it. It's
hopeless.
It is, isn't it? It's chromium plated. It's the darkness of space. It's interesting, isn't it? Its central thing in 2001 is a black geometric monolith. And you never actually see the aliens. You never see what's behind them, I don't think, in any of this, in either that or the sequel. And that's kind of it, isn't it? That's kind of, what can you offer us, Clarke? Well, I can offer you a rectangular slab floating in space. Yeah.
It reminds me of, and I just recently reread Out of the Silent Planet, which is book one of C.S. Lewis's trilogy. And at the end, the Weston character basically says, I've got this bright future for mankind. And basically, we're going to jump from planet to planet to planet. And when this planet gets old and dies, we'll jump to the next one. And then when that planet gets old and dies, we'll jump to the next one. And finally, somebody asks him, what are you going to do when you run out of planets? Then what? If that's the future that you're looking to.
I think that's a very interesting one. I think there's all sorts of things one could pursue there. I think, for instance, one of the problems with things like the space program, bless NASA, is that actually, what is the raison d'être? What are we about? What is the big, you kind of feel, well, the space program, which actually said, well, look, there is a mandate. God has given us the mandate to explore the universe. Okay, I can live with that. I think I can more than live with that. I could thrive with that. But I don't know whether they really, I'm sure they sit around in NASA saying, why are we doing this? And so if we don't do it, the Chinese will do it first. That's not a bright one.
Yeah. When you don't believe in the mandate, or you don't believe that there is one, then there's kind of no point, I guess, in a sense. But
well, I just kind of, it's become a technological. I kind of feel almost. I'm old enough to remember the Apollo program, and I kind of feel there was still a bold, daring, conquering, bold step for man type of thing, and the magic's gone.
Well, I want to get to your books, which paint a much different picture from what we've been talking about. And looking at it, one of the things that really attracted me to it to begin with was, this is a space opera, I guess is how I'll say it. It's a lengthy trilogy.
I can live with that. Yeah.
It's a lengthy trilogy. Where did the idea for this germinate? Was it something quickly formed, or did it?
Oh gosh, yeah. A long time ago, in a galaxy far away. I read a very interesting book which talked about the thinking of the Puritans, and pretty much like most people, I'd grown up with the idea that as a Christian, the second coming was something pretty imminent and soon and full of doom. And the interesting point that the author made was a number of the Puritans, and including Jonathan Edwards, who's a very fine American philosopher and theologian, was actually the idea that the world would get better and better and better before the end. And the point that was made was the Puritan Vision gave rise to many of the great American educational institutions, and there was a sense of it. And I kind of thought, well, hey, that's an interesting idea to toy with, and because that kind of what happens, without giving too much away, what happens at the end, And so I thought, well, let's imagine. I kind of like the idea of the triumph of the church. I'm very worried about this idea, which basically says we're all doomed. It's all going to get worse. Armageddon looms. The Antichrist is, as we speak, stalking the stage, and we may as well just give up, read our Bibles, and huddle under the quilt. And so I thought, well, because basically, why attempt anything like that? And I was involved in university, and the time it was interesting. The American University of Beirut was actually founded by American Protestant missionaries in the 1860s, with something slightly probably secularized at that point, of a vision of education, learning, training, building for the future. Didn't work terribly well in Lebanon, but that's another story. But that idea of being positive, of looking to the future, was there. So that basically just started me thinking. And with my background in geology, I started to think about, well, let's imagine worlds that have been terraformed, been altered, been changed, mankind spread amongst the stars. And then amongst the people who are really thoroughly innocent, suddenly, out of nowhere, a shadow falls and evil starts to creep back in. How would that work out? That was kind of the thinking that I was working on. How in a culture that has never uses guns or weapons, how do you deal with enemies? It was just, and it was sort of such a fascinating idea. It was sort of like looking in the mirror and seeing something. So I started slogging on it. I had no idea how long it was going to take me. And in fact, I started probably the first thoughts would have been in the mid-'80s. I didn't really write the last one until the late 1990s and things like that. So it took a long time.
Yeah, that's interesting. That is something that kind of makes your books series stand out from other books, at least Christian books. A lot of time passes between the introduction to the first book and the first chapter. I mean, your book is set in 13,000 plus AD. In fact, I want to read the statement that you have on the first page just before the introduction begins. It reads, and I'll quote it here, quote, "On the basis of ecological or theological ideas that are not to be lightly dismissed, many people believe that this present world will end shortly. But supposing in this or some other universe, it doesn't." End of quote. And then you follow that up with a quote from T.S. Eliot, from which the book kind of takes its name. That quote states, quote, "And I will show you something different from either, your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust." End of quote. So that's, I mean, that's very different from what we see in other Christian literature. The setting of the book, 10,000 AD or 13,000 plus AD, and in the first chapter, or pardon me, the introduction, in 3,000 plus AD, you have this cedar ship coming to terraform this planet, and by the first chapter, it's 10,000 years later, and the first colonists have arrived, and it just takes thousands and thousands of years.
Yeah, I just had to check. I set the book in 13,851 AD. Yeah, so we got a long time. Yeah, well, I mean, partly that was well, you've got to have time like that. I mean, you cannot form a world just overnight. I know they do it on Star Trek and things like that, but it takes time. It takes time. I mean, you talk to some of the people talking about Mars, they're basically saying we're talking, 20 generations before we see any substantial thing like that. And, it would have to be. So you need the long time scale. But the little preface there was actually I was saying, look, if you do believe that the world ends instantly, I'm not dismissing it, right? If you do believe, and just simply shift me into an alternative universe and things like that. But I do have to say on the ecological one, it's quite interesting. You see, I mean, that phrase would have been drafted in the early 80s. It's got a bit darker since, and I would like to think the books are a ray of light in what is quite a gloomy scene. I mean, I don't want to get into the state of politics anywhere in the world, but I mean, certainly from the European side of things are not positive. The post-war rebuilding vision has kind of faded, and we now just in the business of survival. Even the collapse of the Berlin Wall euphoria has now disappeared. It's there's a lot of clenched teeth in the political world, and there we are.
I don't want to give too many spoilers away for someone who hasn't read the book, but maybe if you could kind of take us through the events of the first couple chapters and give people an idea of what kind of world they're going to be entering, and what the trajectory of where this series is going.
Well, I think it's probably the trajectory I think is relatively straightforward, which is that in a world of innocence, in a community of planets stretched over an infinite distance, evil starts to come back, and evil is not, I hope, I mean, I keep thinking of other ways I could do it, but evil is not simply teeth and claws and weapons. Evil is betrayal. Evil is falsehood. Evil is good, seeking to be good, but in the process becoming evil. So there's a whole series of moral dilemmas. And what I like to think is I try and, in each of the three books, I raise the stakes. And basically, I don't think it's too much of a secret to say that actually it turns out that actually the world of the assembly, which is this great collection of things, is not the only human, or it's not the only sentient entity. Let's just put it like that, and that there is something else, and that something else has to be dealt with. And we lead with that, and I think there are also, there's all sorts of, the spiritual does come into it. Without trying to make sort of miracles everywhere and things like that, but there is a sense of, I like to try and think of a sense of evil, of levels of evil, and underneath the worst kind of demonic evil, like that. That's probably said more than I should say, but there we are.
Now, in your books, you have an organization called the Assembly of Worlds. And basically, what that is the governing authority of all of mankind and its colonies on other planets. So it's basically ruled by uh, the people on the Earth, which they call Ancient Earth in your books, and all of the colonies, all of the other planets that mankind has colonized, are all governed by the Assembly of Worlds. It reminds me a lot of the United Federation of Planets that Gene Roddenberry envisioned in the original Star Trek series. It's perfection. Mankind in your books, by this point, has overcome disease. We've overcome prejudice. We've overcome war. But the difference between your books and your Assembly of Worlds and the United Federation of Planets that Gene Roddenberry envisioned was, in Gene Roddenberry's world, mankind found a way to overcome these things himself. Whereas the characters in your books, it would be more accurate to say that Christ overcame these things through us. Essentially, that's the big difference. By the time your story begins, mankind has, in a sense, made its peace with God and made its peace with each other through the sacrifice on the cross that Jesus made. There's been what we call a worldwide revival, and the entire species of mankind en masse has rededicated itself, has been brought back into communion with God through the cross of Christ. They've become Christians. Now, instead of fighting each other, we've gone about the business of exploration and discovery. We're exploring and colonizing new worlds in the universe, and sin is virtually non-existent. We still get sick and die in your books, of course. The Lord hasn't come back yet. We're not this is not, the second coming of Revelation. But at this point, e everyone is living at peace and harmony with God, at least in the first part of your books. That, of course, changes. But how hard was it to get into the headspace of people who don't have to deal with evil, don't have to deal with a sinful nature, at least in the beginning of the books?
Travis, I suffer from the same problem that you do, which is that I'm a fallen human being. And actually, it's very, very difficult indeed. But I mean, it's an interesting thought, isn't it? And many of our forefathers did, spiritual forefathers did sort of, have this hope that, as in some of the Old Testament prophecies, which I don't think to be totally dismissed, that the in a sense the lion would lie down with the lamb. There would be a great time of when people would live for old age, and it would just be a great, it would be in a sense the triumph of the church. Although I don't think, do I use the word church in the books? I don't think I do, which is an interesting one. But it would be the triumph of it would be the triumph of God's new people. And yeah, I mean, there are parallels with the Roddenberry dream, but he never, of course, worked out how to get from where he was to there, without invoking God. And I tried to sort of make a sense that it would actually work, that somehow sin is dialed down from a major force to a minor force in human existence, and Which it is, but it wasn't easy. And as I say, I keep thinking of things. I mean, for instance, there's one thing I think at one point where someone starts putting up posters about losing weight, and you just think, well, this is just the body that you ought to.
This is a character in the story.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I think that maybe it's posters on this, the idea that actually people are not content with what they are, and this sort of sense of, sinfully grappling with, I want to be something who I'm not, and, all sorts of other issues and things like fear of death too creeping in, which is an interesting one, which presumably in a perfect world, fear of death wouldn't exist. But yeah, interesting.
One of the things that I loved about your books is the way you were able to intertwine the material physical world with the spiritual world. The characters in your books face a cosmic spiritual battle, but it's not just that. They also face a physical battle as well. There's a war fought. There are deaths. There are casualties. There are battlefields. You have the spiritual side to it, but you also have the physical scientific side. One of the moments that really exemplified this for me was when the people on Farholm realize that sin has returned, and it has returned in a big way. There are deaths. There is violence, and they decide that they're going to send a message to their homeworld, back to ancient Earth, to try to warn them, "Hey, this is happening. Red alert. This is going on." There's only one problem because of the distances involved. That message won't arrive for 50 years. And I think it's really interesting the way you were able to merge science with these spiritual issues. You don't often see that kind of attention uh, being taken to science and theology in a science fiction series.
Yeah, yeah. No, there are real problems with space stuff. In terms of vast distances and time and things like that, which of course things like Star Wars just totally just ignores, and actually Star Trek isn't much better. And there are physical constraints and things like that that you have to, that you have to sort of try and work your way around and things like that. Hey, if half my ideas there I knew how to work, I would be incredibly rich. But there are technological developments one can envisage. And I think, it's how you relate to those and things like that. And I think one of the interesting things in the books is this idea that there were the technology protocols where actually people sat down instead of what we do at the moment is, for instance, we get mobile phones and then 20 years later we go, actually, these smartphones have really wrecked society. You'd actually sit down and go, now, wait a minute. If we have this development, how is this going to affect how we are as people and how we are in relationships and things like that? So one of the key hallmarks of the assembly was basically putting humanity before technology. And I'm afraid all I've seen since is that actually ain't a bad idea. We seem to invent first and worry about the consequences later.
What were maybe if you can give an example of the technology protocols in your books? Well, what are some of those?
I think there is. Let me just try and think of some of the ones like that. I think, for instance, I don't know whether I spell it out. For instance, the settlement size is always small. Yes, they could have built mega cities with, skyscrapers a kilometer high, but everything is human scale. Everything is communities. Everything is based around, it's kind of recognizable. It's almost sort of cottage culture and things like that. There is for instance, there's a very large absence of robotic technology or computer technology, for instance, which is relatively minor. But most interactions, most things are done face to face, community to community. One I don't know, it was my quip or someone else's quip, was that it was the Amish in space. or the Amish in space. There's something in that actually you put your community first. For instance, so there's no mega tourism between the stars and things like that. Trips between star systems are done on a fairly minimal basis, as and when is needed. So it's just a sort of interest, thought like that you. I think one thing that is a major theme, actually, you reminded me, is this idea that is coming through more and more of transhumanism, which is that you modify human beings and change them and alter them. That's very much a no-no in the assembly. We are the characters in 13,000 AD are pretty much their bodies are pretty much our bodies. I suspect there may be a few bacteria removed and stuff like that, but basically they are who we are. There's none of this sort of let's multiply the brain power, let's implant silicon chips in skulls, let's do all sorts of wonderful things. Human beings stay human.
Yeah, speaking of transhumanism, I think it was Elon Musk just a day or two ago debuted where he put a chip in was it a pig or something, something like that?
Yep. No, he of course postdates the books, but his shadow would fall. Any reader reading it today, I think, would see his shadow falling on it, and probably not there goes my chance for Tesla. Probably not a favorite, not a favorable one. But that would be. Yeah, I mean, why? Since you've got to ask, okay, Elon, why do that? What are we? And also, is that still a pig? What are we producing at that point? There's some big questions to be asked. And one of the interesting challenges that the Far Home faces, as the enemy, as it were, comes in, is having to make quick decisions when and improvise on some very difficult issues. But there we are.
One of the technology protocols that struck me that was brought up is there's actually a character in the book who uses the voice of Miranda Klein.
Yes, he modifies a voice.
Right.
Yes.
The assembly doesn't have a problem with him using her voice, a facsimile of her voice. The problem is that he does it in such a way that she reaches a note that she wouldn't be able to. So he creates an inaccurate portrayal of her voice.
He's gone beyond that. And in fact, interestingly, of course, that debate is now stalking the corridors of Hollywood. Now, is it James Dean there's supposed to be a James Dean film where he basically is digitized, synthesized, and post-mortemized as a character in a forthcoming film. And a number of people expressed, and that's the sort of thing that the assembly would say, no. You are who you are, and if you died having only made 3, 4, 5 films, that's the way it is, But you, yes, you could probably, if I think in her case she'd bequeathed her voice to be used, but there were rules and regulations, and you couldn't. It was to cheat, it was cheating. That was wrong. That was distortion of what she was as a God-given talent.
We actually just had here, just in I don't know how much of a Star Wars fan you are, but we had in Rogue One, which was a movie that came out just a few years ago. They actually had a completely facsimile version or digitized version of the character, the Grand Moff Tarkin, who was played by Peter Cushing. Peter Cushing has long since died, and died at a point where you couldn't. I'm sure could never have given permission for the technology probably hadn't even been envisioned at the point where he died. So there was no way he could back then have given permission for his likeness. Maybe he could, but to be used after his death. But that raised a lot of eyebrows.
I remember the discussion. I mean, I remember him when he was. I remember him. I think when he was he was first Doctor Who? No, it was William Hartnell. Yeah, but I certainly remember him in the old days. But you see, I mean, we've got to make some rules. For instance, I mean, what's to say, 30 years time, someone isn't going to take your image, Travis, and have you, I don't know, advertising Tesla's, Cheerios, dog biscuits, or, dare I say it, some outlandish political candidate. We've entered into, I don't say I answer those questions at all, but yeah, they're there and they're not going away. And we've got to do some, we're seeing some very cunning editing in, things like election campaigns and stuff like that, which is coming very, very close to digital distortion. I keep waiting to hear Winston Churchill, come on stage and, say vote for, I won't name names, but, it's a tricky area.
What are some other things, I guess, technologically that you see on the horizon that as a Christian and as a scientist might give you concern?
Well, there are the obvious ones about what we are as human beings, but I think and the COVID epidemic, and you've obviously had it very, very bad as we have had in Britain, and it's been pretty bad in France. I think is raising some very interesting questions about meeting together, about community. In Britain, most churches are, I think, only today starting to have any sort of physical meetings. So there's kind of been 6 months of virtual. Now, how does that work? Virtuality and things like that. Are we, what does it mean to have fellowship? This is great. This is wonderful. But to what extent are you and I friends? I'd prefer to go down to the coffee bar with you and, or we could go chill or, go walking or something like that. And I think something you get it in Facebook, don't you? You've probably got 5,000 friends on Facebook, but what point is a friend and things like that. So this is sort of the sense of community being sprawled out. For instance, I live in France as a Brit now, and 20 years ago, if you were someone like me, you would have to have got involved in the local community because that was really all there was. Now I can order my books on Amazon. I can get an English book almost the same speed as I could in the UK. I can download English programs on television and internet and things like that. And it becomes very easy to exist in a little bubble outside of a community. So I think that is a challenge. And I think what we're moving into a very, very troubled post-Christian era. In Britain, we've had a post-Christian era probably since the probably since the 60s. I think in the States it's happening, but it's probably happening later and it's happening faster. But the absence of moral values now is, we really have cut loose. And, he who controls the internet controls what is true, we're reaching some interesting times about what is true, what is, and power. What's power? What is power for? Where does service and humility fit into this?
I'm sorry, I'm flipping through.
Try your
my
question
questions
again.
here. I've got 2 screens I'm looking at, so that's one of the problems we're dealing with is too much screen addiction, I guess.
Well, that is an interesting one. I'm sitting looking at basically 2 A3 screens. I've got more screen than my entire university had in the 70s. But there we are.
What you mentioned kind of the break from Christianity that we're seeing. You said in Europe you guys saw it a lot sooner, and we're certainly seeing it here in the States. What do you attribute that to? And is there a relationship between that and kind of the break from science?
That's a deep question. I'm not sure science actually has had much to do with it. I think possibly technology, which I draw a slight distinction between technology and science. We have, frankly, we've been seduced by technological magic. I mean, I was watching a video of John Piper recently where he was actually waving his iPhone and saying, guys, this thing is keeping you from prayer. This is becoming a little idle. I'm sorry, I'm not going to get a free iPhone either. But there is something in that. It's a loss of book culture. It's a loss of roots. Look, you've got two things. You can look at your phone. You can look at a YouTube video in glorious primary colors with surround sound and fast moving and things. And you can sit and you can read a book Bible. You can sit and read God's word black on white. It requires some discipline to actually go, no, I'm going to read the book. I'm going to talk to God. Facebook comes second, and I don't preach from the high ground on this one. I find this is a challenge. And so I think there's a sort of digital distraction that's going on. I think I do wonder a little bit about how our churches reacted. The tendency in churches when you're faced with change has often been, let's just go back, forget Back to the Future. Let's just go back to the past, and stay there. And somehow I think have to. I remember John Stott saying, famous good old John Stott, you have to look at two things. You have to look at one eye looks at the world, the other eye looks at the Bible, and somehow we've got to try and balance those, and we've got to speak to our culture, our community. We can't just simply long for Puritans coming back or something like that. And it really is a challenge. But the interesting point is, I do think there is a sense, though, I'm being an optimist at this point, I think there's a sense that a lot of people are now realizing the void that we are sliding into and going, wait a minute, are there standards? Is there a truth? Is there a reality? The thing you mentioned with Peter Cushing, actually a lot of people who are not Christians said, wait a minute, I don't like this. I really do. Why don't I like it? So I think intuitively, we've slid down here and we're all, bemused by the magic. But I think there's some real questioning going on about meaning and are we just simply body tissue? And, what is the purpose of it all,
Kind of along with that, I know when Carrie Fisher died, there was, at the end of the same movie, Rogue One, there was kind of a mashup of a digital recreation of her face when she was young, which she apparently, as I understand it, signed on to before she passed away. But then after she died, there was a whole nother movie that was supposed to come out in which she was going to be a main character, and the public literally revolted, at least the fans, because there were some suggestions that the studio was just going to digitally recreate her for the rest of the movie, and the public basically said, no, she has passed away. She did not give you permission for that. And they eventually had to come out publicly and say, look, we're not going to do that. We'll just use old footage. And so it's interesting that I think the public is seeing the morality aspect of that.
But then but then they've got to ask a deeper question: where does that morality come from? Mm-hmm. Because if we are nothing more than chance, what's the difference between molecules thrown up by chance and pixels on a screen? Mm-hmm. Why shouldn't posterity rifle through 21st century images and go, hey, that Travis guy, we could really use him in, I don't know what, So I think there are some interesting questions, and I think the challenge for Christians, and I think possibly one of the advantages of science fiction is it does open, at its best, it opens doors, and I'm not saying I'm in that category, it does open doors, and it says, look, this is on the horizon. What do we do about it? How do we react to this? And I think one of the big themes in the book is danger, again, of giving too much away, is the danger that in seeking to defend what is right, we end up evil ourselves, and it's a classic moral problem. I think that it's interesting, isn't it? The public is, I think, recognizing that things are being stolen from them, and we're seeing that, for instance, in use and abuse of big data, where people are getting a little bit uneasy when their supermarket is emailing them saying, actually, that, have you thought of doing this? And it's not going to be very long before someone goes in the supermarket, sends them a little message saying, you really seem to have been drinking a lot of wine lately. Here's a perhaps we might want to suggest a program that will help you. And the sense that we are losing essential humanity, and I think that is a theme. And I think one of the things about science fiction is it does raise some of these themes about and sense of a warning, saying, look, think about this, think about it now, because it's coming, and it'll come probably sooner than you think. So I think that's an interesting challenge. Sorry.
Along with what you said earlier, God being the basis of morality, I'm amazed at my secular friends who will proclaim that racism is wrong. Which, I'm a Christian. I agree people are made in the image of God. I understand it's wrong. But why does my secular friend think it's wrong? Why does my secular friend who thinks that, like Carl Sagan would say, that we're just stardust, we're just randomly compiled molecules that came together through a very, very, very fortunate isn't the word, I guess random should be the word, because series of events, came together to form people. I mean, if we're all random and there's no reason for us to be here, why is racism wrong? I mean, it's survival of the fittest. So I again, I as a Christian understand it's wrong, but what is their logic for saying it's wrong? And
yeah, well, I mean, we're seeing this increasingly with selective abortion, where in the UK, at least, I can't speak for the States, relatively minor disabilities are, people are now being offered, look, your child is going to be less than perfect. I think we're going to remove that. We give you the opportunity of getting rid of it. And we're not very far away from the Aldous Huxley's Brave New World of eugenics, of producing the perfect person, and that feeds into the whole racism debate and things like this. And it is a sort of interesting issue, that really only Christianity says, look, all human beings are human beings, full stop. Every human being is made in the image of God, and they are respected on that basis, And then, of course, you get the New Testament thing of in Christ, there is the coming together of the races, and so yeah, I think there's some interesting moral, some very, very interesting moral issues, and we've had this particularly, which you've had in the States, about attacking statues of deceased gentlemen, and mainly gentlemen of the past. But there's a soft target, there's guys who can't answer back, but yeah. Lives matter. African lives matter. Poverty in Africa, ghastly. Probably today's equivalent of it probably is worse than slavery in the terms of the deaths on a daily basis. But there we are. Yeah, these are important issues.
There are people out there who look at science and they look at Christianity, and they feel that they're opposed. You might hear the question today, are you a man of faith or are you a man of science? As though, it's almost like asking which dimension do you believe in, width or height?
Yeah.
But how would you respond to someone who would come to you and say you can't be a Christian and a serious scientist, or you can't be a scientist and a serious Christian?
Well, one of the interesting points is the widespread illiteracy of our age. It doesn't help there. I mean, I'm just reading a book at the moment talking about the enormous impact of science on Christianity, and that Christianity gives the idea of a law-giving God gives a basis. I mean, just take the simple question of faith. The science actually depends on faith. We assume that the law of gravity that applies today in the laboratory is going to be the same tomorrow, but we've no way of knowing that. There's no, there's not written in the universe that it says, gravity will always be this, Newton's laws will always apply and things like that. We take these things on faith. I mean, we could all get out of bed tomorrow morning and suddenly realize we doubled in weight, or whatever. Gravity could just, there's all sorts of things. I mean, we make, all the, for instance, space probes, for instance, rely on physical constants operating well within the solar system, and actually in some cases beyond. I mean, whole of astronomy assumes that the laws of physics operate a billion light years away, and so there is an enormous faith. But I mean, why put your faith in that? On what basis? It's an enormous leap, and so the idea that there is a law-giving a God behind all this extraordinary complexity, I don't feel is too improbable at all. So I think if you push people, I think that actually there is a recognition that actually we are all creatures of faith.
One of your passions is conservation.
Yep.
How has your Christian faith affected your interest in your passion for conservation? Is it been a source of that passion, or did it grow out of that? How do the two go together?
That's a good question. I think the answer is it's kind of interweaves. I look at the natural world and my heart goes, yeah, this is wonderful. That's amazing. That's just incredible. The whole thing works. And that feeds into worship, praise, recognition of God's wonder and glory and things like that. But then at the same time, I also sense an obligation. There's a real problem at the heart of conservation, which is that basically, if you're from the secular point of view, if everything we see is just originated by random chance, totally random over millions of years, and there's nothing behind it, so what if species die? We've probably got too many species anyway. We could survive with far fewer species. If, on the other hand, you take the Christian view and you say every species has, in invisible letters, made by God imprinted on it, it's his creation, then that gives you a whole new emphasis on conservation. This is God's world. We are ultimately responsible for it. We are, the mandate given to Adam to look after the garden, I think, is never rescinded. We've fallen, we're a mess, but I still think we have a duty to care, to look after, and to make the world flourish. I think I like to think, I like to think of a world where things are healed, restored. And one of the things about the assembly in the books is the idea that actually these are good worlds. These are great worlds. These are the places. I mean, a number of people have written to me saying, I wish I could live on Farholm. I answer back, I wish I could too. Book me a place. And there is that sense of just a good. And I mean, you have it in the sense in the American dream. The idea that you can just go homestead over the horizon, and you find somewhere to your little perfect valley and things like that. But they're gone, Travis. They're gone. Even in the States now, the frontiers are closing, and I think that's, in a way, one of the things about science fiction that is good, and it's one of the things that I'm trying to touch on, is a sense that there is, maybe my books are westerns.
What evidence have you seen as a scientist, if any, if you've seen any evidence? Is there anything in science that has led you, that has bolstered your faith in the God of the Bible?
Yeah. I think the sheer wonder and complexity of the creation is one. Now, I'm going to give you one here that I suspect a number of your viewers will probably dislike, but the conventional science view is that life on Earth has been continuously around for nearly 4 billion years. Okay, now you think about the Earth's like a basketball. The atmosphere is like a thin sheet of paper on the top of that. Now, if that is the case, let's just say if, and I'm open to other interpretations, things like that. I'm not going to. If that is the case, that basically says we've had liquid water on the surface of this planet for 4 billion years. When you've only got to look at a plane in the sky. If you walked down that plane's wing, you would be dead instantly, within a few minutes, because there's no oxygen, the temperatures are freezing, and if you could survive, the radiation would get you. And yet somehow this planet has, life, and I think there's only two possible explanations. I've talked to, atheists on this one. There are two explanations. Either we are incredibly lucky. The cosmic dice have rolled 6 after 6 after 6 in an unlimited fashion, and everything has just worked out. Or someone somewhere is looking after us. And that, I kind of says, well, to me, that is, God, Lord God, Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the one who, not a sparrow falls, not a hair goes off a head. I think, this is an astonishing planet, and I just think, I look at the complexity and the wonderment of it, and I go, I don't see that as being randomness, chance, or anything like that. I think it's just the hand of God behind the whole thing.
I so love what Chris Walley had to say about the complexity of life and how it not only made it apparent to him that someone was looking out for us, but that someone was the God of the Bible. And while I had him on the Zoom call, I wanted to get his reaction to a passage of Scripture. Now, one of the things that's important to me going forward in these podcasts is that at some point, we always stop and share God's Word. We know that God's Word never returns void. That's what those of us who are Christians believe. Now, things that I say and things that Chris says, and I think Chris would probably be the first to tell you, the things that we say can be thrown away, but God's Word is living and active, and through it, the Holy Spirit can change our hearts. So I shared a passage from Revelation, and this is a passage that talks about God's future for mankind, for the people who have been redeemed through Christ. I wanted to get Chris's reaction both as a scientist and as a conservationist. So as you hear this passage read, compare this vision, the biblical vision, with the vision of the secular humanist that says mankind is eventually going to evolve into something bodiless, without form or individuality. I want to read a passage here from Scripture and just get your reaction to it from a conservationist standpoint. This is Revelation chapter 21. You probably know where I'm going.
Yeah.
Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. What does it mean to you as a conservationist, knowing that there's and I guess as a geologist, knowing that there's a new heaven and a new earth coming?
That's a passage that is very difficult to intellectually respond to. It's you want to weep with that one. That's the greatest of all book endings, It really is. I think that is important. I talk to a lot of conservationists, and as a breed, they are depressed. They're losing. You look at 10 items of conservation news, 8 or 9 will be negative. I just think today about Mauritius dolphins dying off with the oil spill and things like that, and the idea that ultimately there is hope. Now, there are two reactions to that. One is to sort of just say, well, I'm not going to do anything because God's going to pick up the pieces. And the other is to go, I want to do my bit. I want to, I want to hang on in there. I want to try and preserve all I can. Yeah, at the end of it all, the cavalry will come to the rescue, but we don't know when the cavalry will come to the rescue. And in my case, my books, the cavalry doesn't come to the rescue for a very, very long time. But we have to do what we can to preserve. But there's an interesting feature about that passage, which you probably have noted, which is that there is a vision in logical minds of a heaven without human beings, without human culture. It's not in Revelation. There is a city there as well. Now, how we balance humanity, restored, redeemed, transformed humanity, and how we balance that and nature is a very, very interesting one. But some people say you're going back to the garden. Well, actually, it's not quite going back to the garden. It's going back to the garden city. It's the city as well. So there's an interesting thing there. And one of the challenges is not to elevate the human too much and not to elevate the natural, so that every planet is a world of nothing but wildlife and a few bearded hippies wandering around. It's got to be more than that, and there is the city of God, and yeah. If I ever get to the bottom of those passages, I'll be a happy man. But I probably won't get to the bottom of those passages before I die, in which case I will be a happy man. But there we are.
What is the destiny of man? Easy question.
Well, I know what our destiny should be, which is to spread the kingdom of God, which is to build his church, which is to trample on evil, which is to see a world of justice and righteousness and do what we can. It is to steal an American phrase, to build that city of points of light, or whatever the phrase goes. It is that, but it is to put God at the heart of it. But I think it's got to be, and this is an interesting point, it comes back to my mind, think about this, is somehow in Clarke, you lose the physicality of being human. Now, I like to think in my books that people get this, at least the sense in the early book, of these are people who enjoy life. They enjoy meals and food and fellowship and singing, and these are and it's very interesting that our Lord's images of heaven are things like banquets and things like that. They are human. I mean, our ultimate destiny is I believe restored, refined universe, and I have no idea really what that will look like, but it will not be less. We're not going to fade away into little points of little floating photons, or endless terabytes of memory bouncing around in some celestial computer. I think there is going to be we will be human. We will be more human than we are, not less. And I think that's something to think about.
It's interesting when Jesus, who after he resurrected, who obviously was fully God and fully man, but also in 2001 terms is the Dave Bowman, the new
the overman, the new man,
the new man, yeah. It's interesting that he ate and drank and made a point of showing the disciples that he was eating and drinking.
Yeah, he fixed breakfast for the disciples.
So it's interesting that physicality that's there.
Yeah, no, I think this is, and I think the theologians tell us that this is where the Greeks have basically somewhat misled us into talking about sort of ethereal bodies and transcending the body. The body is, for all its flaws, the physical world is an extraordinary creation, and I think there will be somehow, to coin a phrase, a super physicality. It will be more physical, and in heaven. But hey, I'll let you know when we get there.
How is a work of art, a science fiction novel, written by a Christian writer, how is that different than one that's written by someone who's not?
An enormous amount of ink has been spent on this one, a lot of discussion. I really would only speak for myself, I think there has to be some sort of redemptive quality to it. I don't think you can end a Christian novel with the stage littered with dead bodies. I don't. I mean, that may say something about sin. Okay, I suppose you could write a Christian version of Hamlet in which everybody kills them, but I do think, personally, I think that the world, there's enough people writing gloomy, dark, horrible stuff that I think our task is really to put a little bit of light in the darkness. And certainly in terms of the fan mail I've had, the things that are really appreciated are things like, you really helped me over a difficult spot. I remember one lovely lady saying, the thing that I really felt about your books was that I lost my fear of death after reading them. I almost think that's kind of worth the entire effort of writing 750,000 words, Not quite, but nearly, But so there is. I think there has to be. I think I could be wrong, but I think the Christian artist, the world you have to say the world is slightly a better place for having written that. Not chocolate. I'm not talking about saccharin. I think that sometimes that's the worst possible type of bad art. I'm not going to go down that road, but I do think there's sort of sense of people go, yeah, I feel better for that. I'm glad I read that. I'm facing all sorts of problems and difficulties, but for several hours or days or whatever, I was taken out and made to feel a better person and made to think more, and somehow brought in touch with goodness and hopefully righteousness and holiness as well.
What advice do you have to other Christian authors, people who maybe are thinking about writing that book? They've had it in their head for a long time. They think, I can't do this. What advice do you have going into the business?
Well, the facetious piece of advice is get a wealthy spouse. Okay. Well, actually, there's only partly the chance of getting a bestseller. I mean, I've had fantastic reviews, but I'd hesitate. I wouldn't even dare mention how little I've actually made out of the Lamb Among the Stars trilogy. I could have washed dishes in an inn for a year and probably made more, but there we are. But I think there is this sense of calling. There's two things. First of all, writing is, can you write? And write a short story, give it to someone. And if someone says, look, I think that's fine. I like your story. Keep going. I was very fortunate that my wife did that. And I think there is a gift. There is a gift. It's the gift of hearing phrases, of feeling that it sounds right. So I think, first of all, if you've got the gift, fine. And then, is it the calling? Is that what you're supposed to do? But there we are. But as for guidance, gosh, I think the only other piece of guidance is don't imitate. Strike out, try and be new. By the time you imitate a trend, it'll have passed by. Yeah, stick at it. Throw your iPhone away. Cut off the internet. Don't listen to podcasts. Just write.
Well, that wraps up my interview with writer Chris Walley, again, the author of the Lamb Among the Stars trilogy. That consists of The Shadow and Night, The Dark Foundations, and The Infinite Day. And I just have to say it was a pleasure talking to Chris. He is a gentleman, a very creative writer, a devoted scientist. I can tell you he cares very deeply about nature and conservation, and a bit of a theologian as well. If you're interested in reading his books, you can check them out on Amazon. They're available on Kindle. But if you're old-fashioned like me and you want a book in your hands, there are still plenty of used hardback copies floating around on Amazon as well. Lastly, if you've come this far, thank you. Thank you for listening. This is my first podcast, and it was a bit more challenging than I expected. To tell you the truth, there are buttons here and flashing lights, and I still don't know what any of it does. I'm sure you've noticed plenty of bugs, but I've learned a lot, and I hope to bring you more interviews soon. Until then, I'm your host, Travis Kircher, the man with a face for radio and a voice for magazines. You can check out my website at alogbythefire.com. If you like the podcast, visit the Contact Us page and hit me up. For now, keep the fire burning.